y'all, Miss Mayhew here, and I'm going to go over your flip notes on incomplete and codominance. Now, the reason that we go over these two types of inheritance patterns is because these are two types of inheritance patterns that don't follow the same observations that Gregor Mendel made way back when as the father of genetics. The first one I'm going to go over with you guys is incomplete dominance. Now, in incomplete dominance, this is where neither allele is completely dominant over the other. Because of this, you end up with an intermediate phenotype whenever you have two different alleles. One example of a trait or an organism with a trait that expresses incomplete dominance is a snapdragon. So a snapdragon with two red alleles would produce the red phenotype. A snapdragon that has two white alleles would produce a flower with the white phenotype. Now, what's interesting is if you have a snapdragon that has one allele for red and one allele for white. Now, because neither of these is completely dominant over the other, red's not dominant over white, and white's not dominant over red, you get this intermediate phenotype, or this in-between. In this example, that would produce a pink snapdragon. Now, one thing I want to point out here about the annotation that I used. You use the same letter for a trait. So in this case, I'm talking about the color of the flower. So I'm going to use C as my letter. But if I were to use a capital and a lowercase c like you traditionally do with Mendelian genetics, you wouldn't be able to do that because neither of them is dominant. So what we do instead is we use superscripts. So the little tiny R at the top of my C is my red allele for color, and my tiny W above my C is my white. Okay, we just use that because the rules of genetics and science is that you have to use the same letter for different alleles for the same trait. Now, with codominance, this is where both alleles are completely dominant. That means that both alleles are going to be completely expressed. A great example of this is cattle. If you have one parent that is brown, that is because they have two alleles for the brown trait. If you have another parent that's white, that's because they have two alleles for white. Now, if those two parents have a baby, that baby is going to have one allele for brown and one allele for white, which is going to give you a spotted cow. Parts of it are brown and parts of it are white. So both brown is expressed and white is expressed. Just like before, we always have to use the same letter for an allele. So we use the same annotation as before, where we use the little superscript. Now, number 5 is asking if you have a black rooster and a white chicken that mate. How would the offspring look different in the case of that trait being a codominant trait, or if the trait expresses incomplete dominance? So, in the case of codominance, you would see both black and white feathers. We call these like freckled hens. In the case of incomplete dominance, you would see an intermediate phenotype. So not black, not white, but in between, which would be like gray.